Almost.
Okay, great.
All right, there you go. So guys, too, we're going to keep the chat pod open so you guys can talk amongst yourselves there. If you have questions specifically for Kristin, or you guys might be able to answer your questions for each other's community, but if you have questions specifically for her, please put it in the Q&A pod below, and then at the end, she'll start running through them. It just helps us kind of keep a focus so we can make sure that we get all your questions asked. So with that, Kristin, I will let you take it away.
Cool. I'm going to share my screen. I made a little slideshow, and I was thinking this morning about how international this was going to be, and in addition, I added a late addition to the slideshow, which is a view from my office window in Oakland, where it is freezing today compared to usual. So what we're going to talk about today is working on responsive or CMS-based websites in Dreamweaver CC. There are some really great tools to help us theme faster in Dreamweaver than some of the other methods one might use. We can use the methods we're going to talk about for any CMS-based or dynamic site, but we're going to specifically work with WordPress because we primarily build WordPress websites at Mighty Minnow. We make websites for nonprofits, small businesses, and educational institutions like teaching centers at UCSF, for example. We like to use Dreamweaver for theming because it is so complete. It is so many tools rolled into one. We can do our code editing. We can FTP without leaving the interface and basically with zero work on our side. It behaves as a web browser, which I'm going to show you, a code inspector, which is going to be similar to what you would see in Firebug or Chrome Inspect. Can use it to navigate our file system and do really comprehensive search and replaces site-wide. Dreamweaver behaves like a screen size emulator, so some of the stuff that you might have been doing in responsive.is or Responsivizer or other emulators, you can also do in Dreamweaver. And of course, it's part of the Creative Cloud, so you can do things like back up your site definitions using Dreamweaver so that you can share that information between multiple machines. So what we're going to do today, we have a pretty short session. We're going to talk about setting up Dreamweaver for a fast workflow. I don't know about you guys, but our client budgets are always being pinched, and we have to be able to do things more and more quickly with less and less steps in order to stay in budget. So we want to work as fast as we can. So we're going to set up for working quickly, and then we're going to talk about a little bit about setting up your server situation. We'll talk about working locally and working remotely. We're going to look at the new tools in Dreamweaver CC, the CSS Designer in particular. We're going to talk about responsive website development and using media queries. We're going to do this within the context of adopting and modifying a theme in WordPress. We're going to look at the live view, which is where we'll spend most of our time, and also at live code. And we'll be inspecting like we would in a browser inspect tool. We're going to look at modifying and then viewing our page at multiple screen resolutions right within Dreamweaver, so not having to hop out to another tool. And we'll talk a little bit about visual and hand coding workflows. So that's our plan. So with that, hopefully everyone sees Dreamweaver on my screen. Yes, okay. Let me get the chat pod so I can just double check. Okay. Everybody sees my screen and hears me okay, I hope. Okay, I'm seeing yeses. I hope that is directed to me. All right, so for the demo, I'm going to be working locally on a local web server using MAMP. I'm on a Mac, so I have MAMP installed and I have it running. For the purposes of the demo, I have downloaded and installed WordPress from WordPress.org. So I've grabbed this build, And I've installed that build in my htdocs folder in a subdirectory called webinar. So literally just drop the files and fire up MAMP. And then once MAMP is running, I can go to the MAMP homepage, which comes up automatically, and visit phpMyAdmin, where I can add a new database to the list of databases, which I've done. And then that brings me to a page like this, where I can create a configuration file locally on my machine, get started, plug in my database name, plug in my username, which locally is just root, plug in my database host, which is localhost, and my WordPress table prefix, though there's no tables right now. And then I just install WordPress on my machine. So that's all the steps that I took basically before class, but I also added a few blog posts. So I added post 1 and post 2, and I added some featured images, just some gray boxes in WordPress so that we would have something resembling a blog type layout. What we're going to do for the demo is we're going to begin to theme that default WordPress installation with this look and feel. And we're going to do that while working in what feels like a browser interface in Dreamweaver. So I'm going to fire up Dreamweaver, and this is the latest version I updated as of yesterday. I have two site definitions in here. I have a local and a remote site definition. For the local site definition, I have that same folder set as my local root folder that I used, that I deployed the WordPress installation in. And then for servers, I have set up local, that I'm using a local network server. I've just named it MAMP. It doesn't really matter what you call it. And then I said where the root of that server folder was and the URL for that folder. For the work that we're going to do, the most important setting in your site definition that you can set is remote versus testing. And we need to have both of these set up in order to use the live view in Dreamweaver and render our site so that we can work on it. Later, time permitting, we'll look at the remote view as well. But everything we're going to do locally on the MAMP version or the locally installed version of our WordPress installation, we can also do on the remote, just exactly the same. So you guys are probably pretty familiar with the idea that WordPress is a themed, plugin-based themed architecture. And here in my files panel, I can see just all of the files that you have in a basic WordPress installation, plus the images that I added. And one of the things that's a trademark of a WordPress site is that you have a WP config file that you use to connect to your database. This is my WP config file. There's one thing I'd like to point out in here that we need to have in order to have this workflow work in Dreamweaver, and that's that we need to add a line to our WP config that says concatenate scripts false. And if we don't do this, then when we navigate in the browser to the back end of WordPress, the CSS doesn't render correctly. So I just like to point that out. So I have MAMP running, I have Dreamweaver on, and in my browser, I have a rendered version of the WordPress site. Just catching up on where I'm at. Okay, so before I start working on this site, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to launch the site as though I visited the site in the browser. And if I were visiting a website in a browser, the index file would be the first file I would come to. So I launched that file. Dreamweaver tells me that there are PHP or server directives that the rendering engine, the browser rendering engine in Dreamweaver isn't currently displaying, and that I can switch to live view to view that information. When I do that, I switch to live view, I actually get a completely rendered version of the site. So this is what I'm going to be working on, and I'm going to do a little bit of setup in the Dreamweaver interface in order to make this work smoothly for me. One just super time-saving key that I use every day is that Dreamweaver allows me to set up my own keyboard shortcuts. So here we see the standard Dreamweaver keyboard shortcuts, but I can also add a new set of keyboard shortcuts for myself. So I might duplicate the standard set because I don't want to completely recode all of them. I name that with my name. And then I can set whatever keyboard shortcut commands that I want. So one thing that's can be kind of inconvenient is that Dreamweaver doesn't have a keyboard shortcut for Save All, but I'm constantly using Control-S to save the file that I have in front of me. So for Save All, I might change that keyboard shortcut, Control or Command-S, to, instead of saving the document in front of me, to save all open documents. So by selecting Save All and saying that this is a keyboard shortcut I want to use, I've just overruled the default behavior for that keyboard shortcut. Now I can save any open document at one time. So I go ahead and save that. That's going to be now applicable to me. While I'm looking at my preferences, another thing that I like to have set for the workflow that we're going to use is under the category, I like to discover dynamically related files automatically, and that way I don't have to constantly be telling Dreamweaver to go ahead and find the dynamically related files. So those are two things I might set up in advance. And one other thing that you might want to do, depending on whether you're actively developing or you're testing, is under, under View, Live View Options. One thing you can do in Dreamweaver is you can follow the links on the page in front of you, because remember, this is just acting as a regular web browser, so I can browse the site dynamically. I can do this following links by holding down a modifier key, or if I'm testing the site, I might want to follow my links continuously so I can just navigate around the site in Dreamweaver. I don't want to do that presently because I'm going to be in active development, and if every time I clicked on my screen it changed the display of the website I was looking at, that would be kind of frustrating. So I'm going to turn that off. But for testing, especially when you start testing mobilely rendered type responsive views of your site, that might be a handy thing to set up. So holding down a modifier key, I can click Control or Command. I can click around my site just as easily, and that way the default click behavior is present, and I can use that for theming, but then I can also navigate. So that's very handy. So when I'm making a new theme, generally speaking, I'm going to want to start from an old theme or an existing WordPress theme. And depending on how savvy you are with responsive development, you probably want, if you're starting out, you probably want to start with a theme that already exists. You probably want to start with a theme that already exists and modify from there. Now, that's not to say that you can't choose any WordPress theme as a base and add your own media queries, which isn't as difficult as it may seem at first blush. But starting with a responsive theme, especially for a beginner, is going to be especially handy. The theme that I have in front of me, which is 2012, is responsive, and I can demonstrate that by clicking on the different display icons at the bottom of my screen. So I can see a 480 by 800 pixel view. I can see, ostensibly a tablet view, and I can see a desktop view, and I can also see just the full view that uses all of the available real estate. So you can see that the media queries are present because the sidebar at a mobile size is dropping down below, meaning that, the desktop view isn't the only view of this site that we have. Now, before I take this theme and I start modifying it to be my own theme, I want to create a child theme for this particular theme so that I can still take advantage of any security updates that come out for the theme. And I can update the theme with wild abandon without worrying about losing my CSS changes. So before I start theming this site, I'm going to create a new theme for myself. And I'm going to do this by creating a new folder in the WP Content/Themes location, and I'm going to call this Webinar. And all I need to do to make that folder into an active theme is to take the style sheet from the theme I'm working on, which is 2012, and drop a copy of it in the Webinar folder. And then I just edit this theme. So this CSS file, this style.css, I'm going to call this Webinar. And to make this theme into a child theme for the 2012 theme, I just tell it, you're based on the template 2012. And I save it. So I still have a step or two left, but I want to make a change to this theme. I think on line 550. I want to change this color so that when this theme goes active, I can visually see that the color is different. And the color I want to change is this color here, which if I click on that H1 link, I can see in my tag selector that that's h1.site title A, and I can see the whole document object model surrounding that link. And so here, I want to change this color to red, so when I change my theme, I'll be able to tell. So when I go back to the live view rendered version of the site, I don't see that color because I haven't set my theme. But this is really cool. I don't even have to leave Dreamweaver. I can go straight to the dashboard in WordPress, and I can go to Appearance Themes, and I'm just holding down my modifier key to be able to navigate. And I can see that new theme that I created just by duplicating the CSS file here in the dashboard view. Now you'll notice that these two themes have thumbnails associated with them, and my current theme does not. And in order to have a thumbnail in WordPress, all you need to do is have a screenshot.ping. I've prepared one in advance for this gorgeous blog theme. And if I drop that screenshot.ping into my webinar folder and refresh, just like I would in a browser, I can see the screenshot image. Ooh, I can see the screenshot image for this theme. When I activate the theme and I go back to the front end view, I can see that that theme is the theme that I have activated because I can see that red text that I changed. All right, so a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with the related files toolbar at the top of the screen. In a WordPress site, you have a lot of files, a whole lot of files going into contributing to rendering a single page. To me, this is too many files to navigate as I'm just trying to interact with only CSS. So I want to filter down and hide all of the file types I'm not currently working on so that I see a subset of files that are relevant to me. All right, so if I click on, there are a lot of ways that I can select an element in my live view, and one way is to click on the element just with a regular click in the rendered view. And when I do that, I can see that what happens in my CSS Designer panel changes. So I can click here, I see one set of colors. I can click here, I see another set of colors, etc. But this particular view is feeling kind of constrained to me because there's a lot of information that I want to have about the CSS that I'm looking at, and I can't visually parse all that information in this confined space. So in Dreamweaver CC, I can expand that view in my sidebar to show 2 columns worth of CSS information. And generally, this is the view that I'm going to want to have when I'm working on theming. I want to have my files panel open, and then I want to have my CSS Designer open below. So if I were to continue to work on this heading 1 text right here, and I click on it, I can see the color that I set. I can see the hover color, which I also see on hover in the rendered view. And I can see other CSS properties that are being utilized coming together to contribute to how that text looks. So with that selected, say I'm concerned with this color or with the selector upon which that color is set. If I click on that property in the Properties pane, in the left-hand column, I can see a lot of information about that property and where it's defined and how it's defined. So I can see that that color is defined in style.css. This makes sense to me because that's the file I edited only moments ago. And I can see that that style is globally applicable. And what that means is it's not written in a media query or style sheet that's specific to print. It's not written in a media query that's specific to a specific screen width, min width or max width. It's globally applied. This theme, this 2012-based theme, works in the way that makes the most sense to me in terms of setting up the media queries. So it's mobile first. And what that means is that all of the CSS that's written for the top of the style sheet or the large majority of the style sheet is going to apply in every circumstance. So at the top of the style sheet are all my globally defined rules, and then later down in my style sheet, actually not starting until about the 1400th line, I see this media query starting up. So any rules that I write that are globally applicable will apply to mobile, but they'll also apply, unless they're contradicted elsewhere, they'll also apply to the higher screen resolutions. And we'll see how that plays out in a minute. But back to investigating this particular styling in the CSS Designer. So I have colors selected. I see I'm writing in style.css. I see that that rule is global, and those elements are bolded. And then I see that the selector that I'm looking at is bolded in the Selectors section. If I click on that selector, I stop seeing all of the rules in the Properties pane that contribute to the way that text looks, and instead what I see is what's specific to the selector in the style sheet. So I'm going to go back to Design View so I can have more of my screen real estate dedicated. So when I'm looking at this selector, I see only rules that are defined upon the selector. So as I scroll down, I can see that there are certain things that are bolded, like the display, the color, the text decoration, and those are the set properties. But I also see all of the CSS properties that are available to me, so that if I wanted to set an additional property like margin or padding or width, I can do that without having to write that selector from scratch. So I have a visual method I can use to write my selectors. If I wanted to whittle down and see only the things that were set on that selector, I can check the Show Set box and I can see just the set properties. So the distinction for me is, do I want to be able to add new properties, or do I want to narrow down to seeing what's been set for that selector so far? There's another way, aside from just using my regular left click, that I can investigate certain elements on the page. And this is going to feel a lot like using Firebug or using Chrome Inspect. I can invoke an Inspect tool. I tend to right-click to do this. You can also use a keyboard shortcut. You can also view and tell Dreamweaver that you want to inspect. So if I invoke the Inspect tool, I can hover over elements on my page just like I would if I were in Firebug or Chrome Inspect, and I can see over here in the CSS Designer, I can see the rules associated with that element. So something that I find particularly handy about this is being able to see the margin and padding associated with elements, because a lot of times if you have spacing between one element and another, you're not sure if that's written on an LI or on a div. It can be attached to a lot of elements that contain that content. So it's very handy to be able to hone in on exactly where that information is attached. So another little trick about the inspect mode and hovering, if I'm inspecting something on my screen, I can see the tags associated with that inspected element in the tag selector below. So when I'm hovering over this title, I can see that I'm in the site title area, and I'm particularly looking at a link, an A tag. If I want to travel outward from there to see the containing elements, I can use the left and right arrows on my keyboard. So I'm just arrowing through, and I can use that to select a further out element on the screen. If I am ready to commit to wanting to investigate that particular element, I click on it, it locks, so I don't have that traveling inspect boxes as I'm moving my cursor around, and then I see the properties in the CSS Designer. So what's so great about this that's so different to workflows that you might have had in the past, I don't know about you guys, but I have had workflows where I go into a browser, I use an inspect tool or Firebug, I change the property in the browser, I see how it looks, then I go to my text editor, I change the property in the text editor, then I upload that CSS file where I've made the change, I go back to the browser, I refresh, and I see the change. That's a lot of steps and a lot of different software just to affect one CSS change, and in that workflow I actually have to make that change 2 times, once in the browser, once in the text editor, and then refreshing in the browser. So this is super convenient in the sense that I don't have to go anywhere to make the change, to commit the change, to see the change. So say I wanted to change just the general body copy color on the page, I might either click and see where the color is defined, I might right-click and inspect and see where that color is defined, or I can use a method that I've probably been using since Dreamweaver 3, where I just click on the tag in the tag inspector, and then I can also see where that color is defined. So for the body tag, this is a good example of a time where I already know the tag that I'm looking for, and just clicking it on it in the tag selector is pretty convenient. So in terms of the real-time aspect of this, if I see this color in the CSS Designer and I click on the color, I just want to double check, where am I writing about it, what is the reach of the change I'm going to make, and what is the selector I'm using. So I click on the color, I confirm that I'm working on the body selector, and I'm doing it in a way that's going to affect all screen resolutions unless it's contradicted, and I can see that I'm writing it in the style sheet that I have set up. It's pretty cool. Not only that, but here I see style.css has an asterisk next to it, so I can see that that file has a change that I need to save. I use my keyboard shortcut, Control or Command S, and that file is saved using my special keyboard shortcut I set up earlier, even though I don't technically have that file open in front of me. So that change being saved to the location where I'm serving my website from should mean that if I were to go back to the browser and refresh, that's a complete completed change that's saved and ready to go. And if we talk about remote workflows later, I'm going to show you how you can save locally and have that same ease of publishing on your remote as well as on your local version. So I'm not crazy about this red color, so I'm going to pick just a gray like that, similar to what we had before, but you can see the instantaneous nature of it. All right, so I want to show you some other features of the CSS Designer by way of changing the way that this link in the masthead looks. So if I'm looking at this selector for this H1, again, I can see my properties in the Properties Inspector. That rule is affecting. So if I'm looking at this heading 1 and I wanted to change something about it, I can see the rules here, but I can also determine what screen resolution they're affecting. So, sorry, I'm going to inspect this. And I'm going to use my arrow keys to select the H1 instead of the A. And I can see the site header H1 is repeated in the selectors that are used to style that visually, to style that H1. And I can click on the H1 selectors in the Selectors panel, and I can see in the Media Queries section what media query they apply to. So per my comp, my gorgeous comp here, I want to use an image for my logo, which is pretty common. And I want to do this in a way that's going to be universally applied. So I want to do it not just H tag, on the A tag, but I'm going to write it on the H1 tag. And I can see here, if I click on these various selectors, that one of the instances of that selector is only for screen resolutions with a minimum width of 600. In other words, if I were to use this existing selector to add my logo, I would not see that logo below 600 pixels, which isn't, of course, what I want. So I'm going to choose the selector site header H1A that is set to be globally applied in the media queries, and I can use this selector to add the styling that I want. Now, of course, I could add my own new selector, and I could place that selector wherever I wanted, but in order to avoid redundancy, I want to utilize the existing selectors to whatever extent I can. So I want to add my logo to this location. I'm going to go back to the Properties pane, and I'm going to uncheck to show set properties because I want to show properties I haven't set yet, like the background image for that H1. And I can scroll through this panel to see all of the CSS properties that are available to me, start to finish, or I can use the 5 buttons at the top to navigate to the different categories of CSS properties that I have available. So if I wanted to set layout properties, all that using that button does is scroll me to the correct location or the proximity in the Properties pane. I can show text-related properties, border, or background, and background is what I want to use right now. So in WordPress, I've already uploaded the logo that I want to use into my media library. So under background image, I can click and I can navigate to the location where Dreamweaver keeps my media. So it's in WP Content Uploads and then in a dated folder. And I can select the image that I want to use. Now for my purposes, I prefer to set that image path relative to the site root instead of relative to the document. So I set that here, and then I say open, and you can see right in real time the background image get applied to that heading 1 in the masthead. This is really fun. In the CSS Designer, I'm used to typing or dropping down to select my various properties and values, but I have a great visual way that I can do this in the CSS Designer. So instead of repeating on a grid or repeating horizontally or repeating vertically that background image, I just want to show it once. Visually, I get one little icon. I click that, and the background image stops repeating. Now the method that I would use to hide the text that's on top of that background image is an image replacement technique called FARC. There are a lot of image replacement techniques, and you may prefer a different one, but the one that I like to use is just a very simple text property where I set the text indent to a negative value, large negative value, thereby indenting the text that is in that H1 very far to the left and thereby off the screen. So I set that text indent, the text disappears to the left of the screen. So this is a good method, in my opinion, because it is continues to be accessible to screen readers like JAWS, and so your vision impaired users will still have access to that information versus doing something like display none, which may be obscured from vision impaired users. So I've made that change, and what's very handy about this is that I can sort of scroll through in I can scroll through the screen resolutions here to see how that is going to look at various screen resolutions. Well, I have a little problem, I notice right away, at a smaller screen resolution, a mobile-sized screen resolution, because the default font size for that heading is smaller on mobile, therefore the box is smaller, therefore the logo becomes partially obscured. So I want to set a minimum height for that H1 so that the full logo is revealed, basically. So another way that I can navigate my selectors is I can say that I want to look at selectors in style.css, and if I know the selector I'm looking for, site header, I think, header H1, I can type that into the selectors box and filter the selectors that way. So I can click on an element to select it. I can inspect an element by invoking the inspect tool. I can use the tag selector to click on the element at the bottom of my screen to navigate to it in the CSS Designer, or I can filter by typing the selector if I know it and clicking on it in the selectors panel. So the site header H1A is the selector that I want. I double check to make sure that I'm writing in the global view. I might further double check by just checking to make sure that that is the selector I've been using, where I've been writing properties. And then I set a min height for that H1 that's equivalent to the height of the image so that the image is always revealed. So that allows me to have a consistent look for the logo across all of my various screen sizes. Using my muscle memory, basically, I Control S to save this change, and the asterisk that was on that file goes away. So the next thing I want to do is I want to center this, I want to center the appearance of this logo, but I only want to center it for mobile, because in tablet display and in desktop display, I want that to be left aligned because it will look better with the left aligned navigation. But in mobile, since the navigation button is centered, I want to also center that icon. So there are a couple ways I could do this. One way would be to just set the background image to be centered, but I want to do this in a more in an approach that I might use to center any element, whether or not it had a background image. So on the H1, in this case, I'm going to set a width, which would be the same width as the image itself, which is 152 pixels wide. And I can see now that that element has contracted to that width. And then I would set the margin on the left and right of that image, or on the left and right of that element, to auto to center it. Oops. So now that logo is centered, but unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you're viewing your CSS, that is centered in all of our screen resolutions. Now, I could take the approach of adding a media query that says at, you know, below a certain screen resolution, I want to center that image, but because this style sheet is written in a mobile-first way, it makes the most sense to me to write a general rule that's going to affect mobile and have the image be centered, and then to choose the breakpoint at which I want to introduce higher screen resolution styling, which would be min width 600, and I want to then left align that that logo at that size. So I could inspect this logo. oops, I can click on it. I can see that I'm talking about the site title H1. I can select it here, and if you remember, there was a media query already where there's rules about the way that looks defined, and I can select that media query, or I can stay here on the H1, and I can set the margins back to 0. Oops. While I have a little bit more time, I want to point out that the CSS Designer doesn't just give us access to the CSS2 properties that we're used to using for forever, but it also gives us access to a lot of CSS3 properties, which you may have had the experience of having to go to an online tool to plug in your values for rounded corners or gradients or something, because there are a lot of vendor prefixes you might like to use. But all of that is handled right here within Dreamweaver. So if I wanted to give a deeper rounded corner, for example, to my images, I might select this image, and clicking on it, I can see that it's selected in my tag selector, and I might investigate the border radius of an image like that. Now, if I click here on border radius, I can see that there already is a small, slight 3-pixel border radius on that image. But if I investigate the selectors below and I hover over this bolded selector, I can see that that border radius isn't just applying to images in the area that I'm looking at. It's actually applying to images all over my site, including author avatars, comment-related images, etc. So I don't want to use this selector, which is currently bolded, to set my border radius. Instead, I'd want to use a different selector that was more particular to just images that are in the entry header area. So I look here and I see, oh, there is another selector that applies to that image that's more specific. It's only dealing with images in the area of my page that I want to style. And I can go using the border button at the top, or I could scroll and I can set a border radius for that image. There's a convenient way to set the same property on all 4 sides, which is before I set that value, I click on the lock button, and then I can set the value to whatever I want. So I could say, for example, 30 pixels. It's hard to see because that image is selected, but when I deselect it, I see that that border radius has been applied. Similarly, I could also apply gradients to elements on my page, which I don't think we're going to have a ton of time to do. I did want to also show you, just touch upon the idea of, instead of working with these tools on a locally hosted installation of WordPress, I can also use the same tools in the same way using a remote installation. So prior to class, I took a few steps. One is I added a new domain name to my DreamHost account. Then I clicked a one-click install of WordPress in DreamHost, so very, very, very easy installation of WordPress, to set up a remotely hosted version of a website that I could then style. So the website is this webinar website. And if I go to Dreamweaver and I close out of my local site definition and I visit my remote site definition, I can use the same tools to render live this WordPress site, and I can set up right within Dreamweaver. I can set up, oops, I can finish setting up my installation because I'm just using effectively an internal web browser. My password is very weak, but I wanted to race you guys because I thought one of you might see that installation and start filling it out for me. So I beat you, so I'm now working on a remotely hosted version of WordPress, and I can see the rendered view just like I would for my locally hosted version. So the differences are that I set up my site definition for my remote. I set a local root folder, which you do pretty much, or I do. I don't work directly on the server, but I set a local folder for my files. And then I set up my servers, and like I mentioned to you before with my local installation, I have set this FTP server to be both my remote and my testing server. And there's one other very handy setting that I set when I'm working on a remotely hosted version of WordPress, and that is to go to Advanced and tell Dreamweaver to automatically upload my files to the server on save. So when I save my site definition, I actually need very, very few files in order to start working. All I really need is my style sheet for my theme. So if I were to go to the back end, which I can navigate to right here, because it's a brand new WordPress installation, oops. I'm just holding down my modifier key to log in. I can go to my themes, and I can see, because it's a brand new WordPress installation, it's also just using the 2012 theme. With a deluxe install on DreamHost, it installs all these crazy themes for you, so you have a big choice. But I might like to use this responsive theme. All I need in order to do the same steps that I showed you a few minutes ago for local is to visit my server, grab the responsive style sheet. I don't actually even need the whole theme. I just need that style sheet. I download that here. And then if I want to make a new version of the site, I create a new folder. I drop that style sheet in like I did before. I change the template name for the style sheet and the name of the theme, and then I upload that. So I've already done that in this instance, in the sense that I already created a folder, and I already put a style sheet in it and changed the name. So if I wanted to change the, I'm getting the rainbow wheel of death, but if I wanted to change the theme to a child theme and start theming it, it would work the exact same way. Oops. Might be time to go to questions. So let me get the Connect pod back and see what people are asking. Okay, do you guys have any questions for me?
Kristin, you can scroll. You might want to glance too from the top of the Q&A pod.
Oh, I see. Oh, gosh. Non-PHP CMSs. I don't know the answer to that. Alejandro or one of the Dreamweaver guys want to talk about that? Can you achieve the same thing using the CS6 desktop suite? Not to some extent. You can use similar features. You can, I think, render the site. I'm pretty sure you can render the site in live view, but all of the CSS Designer features, like the expanded view of the CSS Designer being in 2 panels, and the ability to visually change your properties, and also having the CSS3 properties in there, would not be something that you could do in CS6. Okay, so the concatenate scripts thing, honestly, on Numo Temp, I haven't tried that on Windows, but in theory, I can show you what happens. So if you see it, you would know what it was. And that is, if I have my WP config and I don't have that line, so I'm going to save that. And if I open up Index and I go into Live View, and I log back into WordPress, I can see like the style sheet doesn't render correctly at all. So,
Kristin, I think I might have lost you because you weren't, I don't know if you were sharing then. You were doing the demo, right?
Oh, right, sorry. I just want to quickly, can I show this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So if I were, can you guys see my screen again? Okay.
Yeah.
If I didn't have the concatenate scripts line, this is what the dashboard view would look like. My styles just don't get rendered. So if I put that back in and I go back, I might have to get out of live view and back in, but if I go back, I can see that the dashboard will be rendered correctly again after I throw in that concatenate scripts line. So that's if you see that on Windows, you would know what it is, but I don't know if it occurs on Windows or not. Can I send the code for the concatenate scripts? I think so, yes. You can just copy this into the chat pod if you like. I have just a little comment in there, and there you go. So there's some questions about, I think, about Creative Cloud pricing, and that's all online, monthly subscription model, and I know there's discounted pricing for existing Creative Suite users. And some questions about WordPress camps. WordPress camps are really fun. If you have the opportunity, you should go. So were my test and remote sites in the first part of the demo in the same physical location? My remote site is actually live hosted on DreamHost. So that's just like a one-click install for DreamHost and then setting up the FTP connection to that. Oh, are there any websites with sample code or plugins that I recommend? There are a lot of plugins I use all the time. This is one approach, is to use Automatic's themes that they publish as sort of the defaults for WordPress. And that can be a really great approach because they're very commonly used and a lot of questions can be easily answered. For production, we usually use something a bit more complex, which is we use the Genesis framework, and there are a lot of plugins that go with that, but there are also a lot of plugins we just like. But the Genesis framework is a premium paid framework, and in terms of the demo, it actually works exactly the same in the sense that you make a child theme using a separate folder and its own CSS file. And so it works exactly the same way for Genesis, but I don't want to demo something that's going to cost you $100 or something. I want to demo something you can do for free. My impression, yes, is that Joomla is going to work the same way for rendering, because all you're doing is rendering the PHP files into a complete website. So I don't think you'd have any problem doing the same thing with either Drupal or Joomla. There's a question in the chat pod about the workflow being just for theming, and this workflow actually works great also for changing any PHP files that you need to change. And I could demo that, but effectively, if I'm using the inspect tool and I see, for example, a class that's applied to an element on my screen, and I know what that class is, I use Dreamweaver Search and Replace to search through the theme folder, the original theme folder, for example, 2012, for whatever the piece of code is I'm looking, and then open that file, save a copy of that original file into my child theme, and modify the PHP. So creating a child theme, which I think in Drupal is called a sub-theme, but it's the same idea. Creating a child theme and editing the PHP is still, that's part and parcel with what we do in this workflow in real life. There's a question about preferring CS6 or CC to theme WordPress sites, and I definitely prefer CC. for that because I really like having the extra real estate for the CSS Designer, and I also like the extra CSS3 properties that are available to me. And yes, it crashed, but it didn't crash during any of my prep, and I have a sense that it's partly to do with the fact that I'm running Skype through the machine as well. My machine's getting bogged down. Am I missing any questions? If anybody has a pressing question that they asked earlier up in the chat pod, if you want to repeat that question, that would be great. CSS Designer Panel, a separate window like in the old Dreamweaver. I believe so. Can I not? Yeah, I can just drag it out. So I can just drag it out and it floats just like any other panel would. There's questions about child theming. WordPress specifically, child theming is just a way to use an existing theme without actually modifying that theme's core files. So with 2012, something you're going to find is that automatic releases new versions of that theme with security updates or other enhancements. And if you started editing that theme directly, you would end up with your changes getting overwritten, and creating a child theme and using that CSS file and or any other PHP files that you wanted to overrule allows you to create your own theme based on a theme without worrying about it getting overwritten. Are there any additional extensions that I use? In Dreamweaver, I don't have any extensions that I use of late. In WordPress, there's a lot of plugins that I use. I can give a short list. I can add a short list to the end of the PowerPoint, and I can ask the folks at Adobe to upload that if you guys would like. Are there any other questions? Oh, I see you guys are chatting in both pods. Fluid grid layouts with WordPress. So that's an interesting question. If I were going to want to work a responsive grid built in, the problem that you would encounter trying to use the fluid grid layout tools in Dreamweaver with WordPress would be that when you move a block in the fluid grid layout, it changes not just the CSS, but it also changes the underlying HTML. And so because the HTML in a CMS-based site is rendered on the fly, you can't easily change the CSS by just dragging things, or I'm sorry, the HTML just by dragging things around, because that HTML is coming from a bunch of different places. So currently, there's no way to merge the, unless I've missed something, and Alejandro can comment on this, but there's no way to merge the fluid grid layout with the WordPress or CMS layout that I've been talking about. However, there are a lot of themes that you could use that sort of emulate that idea. Would work just the same. I've used Bones for Genesis as a theme that I created a child of, and it worked fine, but I wasn't compiling my CSS, but I imagine there would be a few extra steps, but I think it would work well. John says it does work. He's using it right now. So there you go. I'm not seeing any other questions. But it sounds like the
Yep, I'll try to get it posted up on the Tech Lab site here in 20 minutes.
Yeah, there's a question about CSS transitions working with WordPress, and can use the CSS transitions with WordPress with this workflow, but you have to move the rules, because I think what happens is the rules want to write into one of the PH files, and you have to move them into your file sheet after. Other than that, it works fine.
Hey, Kristin, your audio went really wonky. I don't know.
Okay. Well, maybe we should wrap it anyway, I guess. 11:02. Everyone. Can you hear me? Hello?
No,
Hello?
still Matrix-like. Yeah, maybe we can't hear you at all. So maybe if there's other questions, guys, we can try to have Kristin answer them in chat. Autobot. Sorry, Kristin, something went crazy. Do you all have any other questions for her? All right, looks like we might be wrapping it up. Well, thanks you all for coming today, and I'll get this posted up here shortly. Thanks so much, Kristin, for all your time, and look forward to talking with you again soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Bye, guys.